This is not a missile. There is a pilot inside it. The jet engine is already an afterburner. Beneath the F-104 sits a solid fuel booster powerful enough to throw the entire aircraft off its cradle. No taxi, no takeoff roll, no runway, one switch, one blast. Then nearly 500 kilometers per hour in less than 8 seconds. West Germany did not build this for a stunt. It was preparing for a danger NATO considered fundamental. Its airfields might be struck before the aircraft on them could launch. If the runway became a field of craters, the fighter would leave the ground like a missile. Today, Zell is easy to dismiss as Cold War insanity. Strap a disposable rocket to a starfighter, point it upward, and hope the pilot survives long enough to deliver a nuclear weapon. But that version misses the military logic. Zell began with a rational question. How do you preserve a retaliatory force when the enemy knows exactly where your airfields are? The system could fly. The tests proved that. The real question is what remained after the runway disappeared. How much of an airbase did NATO still have to carry with the aircraft? By the late 1950s, West Germany sat on Europe's military fault line. To the east stood the Warsaw Pact. To the west stood NATO air bases containing aircraft, fuel, weapons, radar, and long strips of concrete that could not be concealed or moved. An airbase was a powerful combat system. It was also a fixed coordinate. NATO planning did not state that every airfield would certainly be destroyed. It did require the alliance to prepare for a general war beginning with a surprise nuclear offensive. In 1957, MC-48/2, it called for dispersal and redeployment so NATO forces could survive the opening phase. Air forces in particular were to be dispersed as widely as possible. The logic was brutal. Concentration made a wing easier to maintain, fuel, arm, and launch. But a strike against the right stretch of concrete could trap that wing on the ground. Destroying every aircraft was difficult. Cratering the runway they all needed was much easier. NATO therefore explored hardened shelters, auxiliary fields, rapid runway repair, prepared road strips, short field systems, and aircraft able to take off with little or no runway. The idea was not uniquely German. The United States experimented with rocket-launched F-84s and F-100s. The Soviet Union tested a similar concept with a MiG-19 derivative. All were responding to the same fear. An aircraft that survived the first attack was still useless if it could not leave the ground. The aircraft chosen was the F-104 Starfighter, West Germany's heavily modified version of a fighter originally designed for daylight interception. Its fuselage was long and narrow. Its wings spanned only 6.7 meters and was optimized for speed, not rough field operation. But the F-104 was no longer the original interceptor. West Germany wanted one aircraft for interception, reconnaissance, and low-level strike in poor weather. The structure was strengthened. The avionics and payload system were changed. In NATO strike units, the Starfighter could carry a nuclear weapon. That mission made ZELL attractive. An F-104 dispersed away from its main base had a better chance of surviving than one parked in a neat line on a familiar apron. If the launch order arrived after the runway had been cratered, the rocket could provide the acceleration that concrete no longer could. But the Starfighter's small wing created a severe transition problem. On a runway, the aircraft had distance in which to build airflow over its control surfaces. On the ZELL cradle, it had to go from stationary to controllable flight almost immediately. The booster therefore had to do more than lift the aircraft. It had to push the F-104 through the brief interval in which the pilot had wings, but very little authority over them. Lockheed's solution looked brutally simple. The F-104 sat on a cradle angled roughly 20 degrees upward. Under the rear fuselage was a Rocketdyne RSB-202 solid fuel booster. The booster weighed almost 1.9 metric tons. That number mattered far beyond the launch itself. A supposedly mobile ZELL site still needed heavy transport, lifting equipment, trained handlers, secure storage, and precise alignment before the aircraft could be fired. The runway was gone, but the ground organization was not. In exchange for that burden, the booster produced about 289 kilonewtons of thrust, roughly 4 times the thrust of the F-104's own J-79 engine, for 7.9 seconds. Before launch, the J-79 was already running in full afterburner. Holdback fittings kept the aircraft on the cradle while thrust built. The booster ignited. The fittings sheared. The entire assembly surged forward. According to the later recollection of German test pilot Horst Philipp, acceleration was about 2g. The more immediate problem was crosswind. Just after release, the aircraft wanted to roll downwind and turn its nose into the wind. For the first moments, control inputs achieved almost nothing. Only at roughly 100 to 120 knots did the Starfighter begin to answer. Then the sequence accelerated. The aircraft passed 250 knots. The landing gear retracted. The booster burned out and dropped away with its attachment frame. From the 8th second onward, what had looked like a missile became an aircraft again. That was Zell's cleverness. The rocket did not replace the jet engine. It purchased a few seconds of acceleration that a runway normally supplied. It was also the danger. A solid rocket had no throttle and no rejected takeoff procedure. Once it fired, the pilot could only complete the launch or eject. Lockheed did not place a human being on the cradle first. Before the piloted launches, the team fired steel and concrete dummies shaped like crosses. Their weight, center of gravity, and inertia reproduced different F-104 load configurations. The engineers called them iron crosses. One early test showed why they were necessary. The booster separated incorrectly, struck the dummy, and began burning in a way no one wanted near a fuel-filled aircraft. A later technical recollection compared it to a giant pinwheel firework. Several team members reportedly suffered minor injuries while escaping, not from the rocket itself, but from holes in vehicles in their path. The story sounds comic after the fact. At the test site, it was a warning. The team changed the nozzle lock, booster attachment points, and the holdback system. It also confronted a human question that could not be engineered away. If the rocket failed near the ground, could the ejection seat save the pilot? The Lockheed C-2 seat did not offer true zero-zero capability. Escape at zero altitude and zero airspeed within the seat's certified conditions. That was a serious weakness in a system that began at precisely 0 and 0. The answer was the Martin Baker GQ7, which offered much better low and slow escape performance. EADS credits the ZELL program with helping drive the wider conversion of German F-104Gs to the Martin Baker seat. The most useful legacy of the rocket launch program may not have been the rocket. It may have been a better chance for a pilot to survive. The aircraft at the center of the program was an early F-104G, construction number 2002, carrying the code DA+102 during its American test career. At Edwards Air Force Base, the program ran in 2 phases from late 1962 to July 1964. Dummy configurations were cleared first. Piloted launches followed. The aircraft's specialist history records 8 ZELL takeoffs at Edwards in 1963, and the central mechanism worked. The F-104 left the cradle cleanly. The booster carried it through the dangerous speed range. Separation occurred. The pilot continued under J-79 power and recovered conventionally. The final program conclusion was that zero-length launch of the F-104 was technically feasible, but feasible was a precise word. It did not mean ready for war. Edwards offered Lockheed engineers, instrumentation, a controlled safety area, and time to prepare. A wartime ZELL detachment would have to hide from reconnaissance, endure weather, receive orders through damaged communications, and bring the correct aircraft, pilot, fuel, booster, ground equipment, and weapon together before the site was found. Edwards answered the aerodynamic question. Europe would have to answer the logistical one. In 1965, DA+102 returned to West Germany, received camouflage, and became DB+127. The following year it arrived at Lechfeld to prove that ZELL could work outside the California test establishment. 7 launches took place between May and July 1966. Lockheed pilot Ed Brown made 5. Horst Philipp made 2. On July 5th, Philipp became the first German test pilot to press the ZEL switch. He had prepared to reach the ejection handle if anything failed. Once the booster fired, the crosswind demanded his attention instead. The F-104 rolled and yawed. At first, the controls offered little response. Speed built. Airflow reached the wing. The aircraft began to obey. Only a few seconds separated helplessness from control. The booster fell away. Philippe continued the flight and landed. No live nuclear weapon was carried. No mission crossed Warsaw-packed air defenses. But the core sequence had been demonstrated on German soil. Prepare, ignite, control. Separate, continue, and recover. If the only question was whether a fighter could take off without a runway, ZEL had won. These launches took place during the national Starfighter crisis. The Deutsches Museum records 44 aircraft lost during one 18-month period in the mid-1960s, while official German sources agree that 116 pilots died across the type's German service. Those deaths do not prove that ZEL was unsafe or useless. They explain why the GQ-7 seat, low-altitude escape, training, and survival margins were not abstract engineering concerns. And if ZEL had ever launched in war, it would not have been a spectacle. Its purpose was to preserve the option to carry out a nuclear strike in Europe after the opening attack. Now remove the runway from the diagram. What remains? The F-104 still required fuel, oxygen, electrical starting equipment, J-79 spares, radar and navigation test gear, trained technicians, communications, weather data, and ground security. For a nuclear mission, the weapon also had to remain protected, controlled, and integrated under alliance procedures. Dispersing an aircraft was one problem. Securely dispersing the complete weapon system was another. The booster was a single-use item. Sustained operations required another booster, another installation cycle, and another firing site that had not been located. ZEL could move one aircraft off one launcher. It could not create a sortie generation system by itself. Then came the question the launch footage concealed. Where would the aircraft return? ZEL did not give the F-104 vertical landing. It still needed a surviving runway, a repaired strip, a road base, or a separate recovery system. West Germany also tested SATS, catapult launch and arresting gear recovery, on a short prepared strip. SATS was not simply the landing half of ZEL. The programs were parallel approaches to runway dependence, placed beside each other, however. They exposed the same limitation. Sustained flying still required NATO to recreate many of the functions of an airbase. Calling ZEL a pre-planned suicide mission is therefore too simple. The system did not require a one-way flight, but if every recovery location had been destroyed, a spectacular launch could not manufacture a place to land. Air power does not exist in one dramatic moment. It exists in repetition: launch, recover, repair, rearm, and launch again. ZEL was also overtaken by strategy. It matured under the logic of massive retaliation, when a European war might escalate almost immediately into nuclear exchange. In that framework, preserving even one retaliatory launch could carry enormous value. During the early 1960s, however, the United States pushed NATO toward a wider range of responses below all-out nuclear war. That process culminated in flexible response, formally adopted in 1967 and issued in final form in 1968. The threat to airfields did not disappear. What NATO required from its air forces changed. A force expected to fight across several levels of conflict needed endurance, repeated sorties, and a resilient network of bases, not only the ability to fire one aircraft from a cradle. The Lechfeld tests ended in 1966, before flexible response was formally adopted. A document written in 1967 did not reach backward in time and cancel the program. Rather, Zell lost priority as strategy moved in the direction that the later document formalized. The rocket-launched fighter had answered one question. NATO was beginning to ask a different one. So was Zell a missed breakthrough or a mad idea? It was neither. It was a technical success built around an operational concept that was too narrow. Engineers took an F-104G from a standstill to controllable flight in seconds. Pilots actually made the launches. The program even helped accelerate adoption of a safer ejection seat. But Zell mistook one necessary condition for the whole system. Taking off without a runway did not mean fighting without an airbase. Air power was fuel, people, weapons, information, maintenance, and somewhere to return, all functioning together, more than once. The answer NATO pursued was not simply replace the aircraft with missiles. Nuclear-capable aircraft remained part of the alliance's force structure. What disappeared was this particular method of launching one. The image of an F-104 leaving its cradle like a missile does not show the moment NATO invented the future. It shows the moment the Cold War produced a nearly perfect answer, just before strategy changed the question.